director of the DeVos Art Museum. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I want to thank all of you for your support. Events like this and exhibitions and programming are all because of our annual donors, so thank you. Tonight we're going to hear from Stephen Bridges, as well as celebrate the 32 artists that are in north of the 45th. You'll have time to vote if you haven't already until 7:30, and then I'm pulling the ballot box. So make sure you get your votes in by then if you haven't already. We're also opening an exhibition in our permanent art gallery called Familiar Facades, so make sure you see that show as well. For those of you who don't know, North of the 45th is an annual show that's been happening at the museum for about 12 years. It features artists. It's a jury show, so every year we have a new juror come on in. And it celebrates artists working in the region north of the 45th parallel in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Welcome. So this year's juror for the exhibition is Stephen Bridges, and Stephen comes here from the Eli and Edythe Broad Museum at MSU. He's an associate curator there, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the projects that he's worked on and a little bit about the process of jurying the show. So please help me in welcoming Stephen Bridges.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Emily. It's wonderful to be back. I've actually, come on in. Hi. This is my second time here. I was actually here, I guess it was a couple years ago now, involved in a similar process, but this time it was a little bit different. That time it was more of a group process, this time individually. So it's wonderful to be back, and thank you all for coming out this evening. So as Emily said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my own personal work and my own practice, and also touch upon the jurying process for the exhibition that's on display here. But really, reflecting on the process that I went through to kind of select the works for that exhibition, I was really thinking a lot. That kind of led me to kind of think about my own work in a certain way. And really, what I was drawn to in thinking about the North of the 45th exhibition was how context became so important. The works that I was most drawn to through that jurying process really somehow evoked for me, being an outsider admittedly, but it's some idea of the sense of what it meant to live and to work and to make art, to have some kind of creative expression north of the 45th. How that geographical kind of, delineation also kind of defines certain other aspects of social, cultural, and political, economic life. So this idea of kind of context being a very important determination, or determining a lot of the ways in which we work and how we work, I kind of wanted to frame my own practice within that same conversation. So I'm going to basically go through a number of concepts that I think that are important to me, that I'd like to share with you to kind of shape my practice in general, and then touch upon a number of exhibitions, I guess within the last 4 to 5 years, that took place in different contexts, and kind of unpack the different ways in which those contexts were important or otherwise helped kind of define the work that was produced, and also highlighting kind of different strategies involved within those processes. And part of this too has to do with the fact that within a lot of the conversations around globalization, there's almost this loss of the local within that. And for me, I found it really, I found it really meaningful, the ways in which you can work locally but also speak to kind of larger or more global concerns. And having that dialogue between the local and the global becomes really, really important to me. So, sorry, let me just consult my notes really quickly, make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yep, so the first thing I want to talk about is this, the idea of where this idea of the curator came from. So the word curator comes from curare, which is a Latin term which means to care for, about. And really, modern curators, if you can even call them that, came about mostly with the development of libraries around the 16th, 17th centuries, and in particular kind of overseeing these kind of, what they were called cabinets of curiosities, or otherwise these stores of knowledge, these collections of different materials, lots of times books, but also artifacts and other things. But the curator was really this person that kind of held all of that knowledge and all of the kind of, the key to accessing all these different objects. And really was in charge of caring for these objects. Because I work primarily in the contemporary realm, and at the museum that I work for currently, and other museums that I've worked in the past, there's a registrar or someone else that's in charge of the collection, right? Like they oversee the care of those objects. So for a long time, that sense of care, of what it meant to care for something, was this idea that I was grappling with, because I don't, no longer is it really my position or really my purview to be caring for the objects that I work with. So I was trying to understand how that sense of care might be changing. And one thing that I realized years ago now, but the meaning of care was actually still something that was very important to me. And rather than caring about objects or even the sense of being this kind of authority over certain objects or certain forms of knowledge, this idea of care is really something that I think about in terms of the ways in which we work, the process in which an exhibition or project unfolds. So the care extends more towards the network of stakeholders and individuals involved in those processes, the caring for the different people, the artists, the galleries, the donors, the lenders, all these other, all the people that are involved in these projects, making sure that they are being cared for, those relationships are being cared for, and expectations otherwise met. And so that sense of care extends more towards this social network, in my mind, involved in these projects, rather than perhaps this kind of care over an objects or collections. And part of that too has to do with, a shift in the idea around the kind of authority of the curator, the authorial voice of the curator. So in a lot of the projects, of course, I have a certain level of knowledge and expertise that I bring to the table, but it becomes a more dialogic process, especially working in the contemporary realm. A lot of times the work is new, it's just been made, 5 minutes before the exhibition opens. So it's like, our understanding of it is evolving, it's changing in real time. And so any form of kind of historical perspective is lost, or maybe just it's a moot point. And so it really becomes much more about a conversation. And so as a curator, it's definitely a different, it's again, this kind of more dialogic process. It's more of like, I know this, you know something, let's share the knowledge that we have together. But within that too, I think you get a sense of what it means also to care. So the other key term I want to talk about is myopia. And I want to preface this. I realize whenever I talk about this that there's this potential that I could somehow be speaking negatively about people who have nearsightedness. I'm not interested in nearsightedness as a physical condition. It's more the second definition you see here that is of interest to me. It's this more metaphorical idea of this lack of perspective that we have, this lack of a longer term vision that we have. So many of the things that I feel like we confront today in this kind of in our present time, so many of the issues, whether it be social and class issues or climate and environmental issues, or choose your pick. But some of these things I feel like, if not exacerbated, are also kind of created by this kind of this myopia that we kind of collectively suffer from. This ability, this lack of imagination and foresight to addressing these issues. Because what it means to address some of these things would require a much longer term vision, a much longer term perspective, and longer term dedication to solving them. In many cases, we know exactly what we could do to solve some of these problems, but are unable to kind of set the things in motion and stay dedicated to actually addressing them. So this idea, this kind of the metaphor of the myopic vision or myopia is something that I've often used to frame some of the projects that I've worked on, and specifically working with artists that are interested in kind of, I really like this phrase, making the invisible visible, working in the kind of visual arts or contemporary arts in general, this idea that artists are able to kind of make some of these invisible things visible to us, otherwise drawing our attention to them and pointing to the ways in which we need to be more conscientious, or otherwise calling attention to our myopic views on some of these matters. So previous to working at my current at the current museum, at the Edythe Art Museum, I worked at the MCA in Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And that was my first institutional post. And again, thinking about context, this is a public institution, a freestanding institution in the city of Chicago, in Illinois. All of these things come to bear on the identity of this institution. And the one project that I want to talk about in particular that I worked on there was with the artist Doris Salcedo, who is a Colombian artist. She's kind of an older generation that came about in the early 90s, post-minimalist movements, and really a more major figure within the international art world. And this was her retrospective exhibition that I worked on at the museum that opened in 2015. And of course, being a retrospective exhibition, it contained all aspects of her work from her entire career. So the question was, how do you present this exhibition of this kind of very well-known artist, obviously very important exhibition for her, but also make it somehow resonant with the city of Chicago, the audiences that exist in Chicago, that museum, that particular museum. So I'll talk about one way in which we did that first, or in a moment after we look at some of these images. If you're not familiar with Doris's work, her work, really for her is rooted in the history of Colombia, and particularly the Civil War that up until only recently ended. And so for nearly 50 years, there was a long-standing kind of armed conflict in the country, and of course, a considerable amount of violence, and many people, thousands if not millions of people displaced and disappeared. So her work really is rooted in her own personal experience as well as that of her native Colombia. And much of her work deals with those issues. This work in particular is called Plegaria Muda, which is a series of, it's over 100. I think we showed 110 of these sculptures, but I think there's over 130 if I recall correctly. And there's these two tables essentially that are sandwiched, that kind of sandwich each other, and between them is a layer of dirt. Of course, as you can see through these images, they have the kind of suggestion of almost kind of these like coffin-like forms. But the conversation that she was interested in was really the ways in which the perpetrator of violence and the victim of violence are they're always connected. In a way, almost this idea that one is very similar to the other, and the ways in which one becomes a perpetrator of violence or a victim of violence. I mean, the forces that determine that are so kind of arbitrary at times that one could easily be the other. And so in this way, she's kind of using these tables almost as, bringing two individuals together within this kind of conflicts. But this piece is actually very hopeful, at least in my opinion, because within these pieces, grass grows up from outside of the sculptures through the top board or the underside of the top table, I guess one could say. And I mean, this is incredibly difficult artwork to install. It takes 5 weeks to install this work. You literally are watching grass grow for much of that time, or hopefully, if it works, right? But the amazing thing about this piece is that, within these sculptures, there's obviously grass seed that's been planted, and the tiniest, finest little holes have been drilled at the top of this piece. And the beautiful thing about life, as we know, is that wherever life can exist or can survive, it will. And so these tiny seeds obviously recognize that there's the smallest shaft of life breaking through, and as they grow and become seeded, they find their way to that light and grow up. So you have these kind of single blades of grass that grow up through the sculpture. But this idea that life can still go on, that there is this perseverance of life within these sculptures is a really kind of, I think, a beautiful statement. And so this was the entrance of the exhibition, entrance and the exit of the exhibition, the first piece that you saw. Some of these other installations, detail specific episodes within the history of Colombia, specifically kind of mass killings or other kind of, historical moments of violence. Her use of materials is very specific. She often uses, we can see here, kind of more domestic elements, doors, tables, chairs, dressers, or kind of armoires and some other works, as you'll see. And the furniture really becomes stand-ins for the missing or the absent body. And the way that we even talk about furniture, it's what's called a catachresis. It's an improper use of language. So we don't really have another term for like the leg of a table. So we use anthropomorphic language. We call it a leg. Of course, so in that case, we're projecting the human body onto these objects. So when we talk about the chair as having a back, arm, the arms of a chair or something like that, all these things kind of project this kind of very human, physical, bodily kind of language as well as perception onto these objects. So they become very natural stand-ins for the body. But oftentimes a lot of these objects, Doris would recover from families, from individuals who have lost loved ones to the conflicts in the country, and then she would kind of combine them in unexpected ways, almost in a violent, but also, I mean, this is kind of the enigma of them. There's almost this kind of violent clash between them, but then through that kind of the ways in which they combine into a single form, they support each other in the same capacity. It's another installation called Atrabiliarios, in which she's embedded each of these holes in the wall, each of these kind of cases in the wall is filled with shoes. So, oftentimes what's left over in these kinds of, mass killings and stuff like that are the shoes, or the shoes is what's used to identify victims. So obviously a very kind of haunting, but also beautiful installation. But this work in particular was something that developed out of research that she did in Chicago. And so I worked with Doris, very closely in creating this work, but she became very invested in interviewing mothers who had lost their children to gun violence in the city of Chicago. And so, just to step back for a moment before going deeper into this work, bringing a retrospective of the work of Doris to a city like Chicago. Of course, while her work is based in a very different part of the world and very different specific historical events, the resonance that existed there, the violence that exists in Chicago, there was a kind of an immediate direct connection there to be made, and to say that while this happens here, it also happens here. And I think from my own experience, I've never seen an exhibition where so many people that experienced it, cried in the galleries, or that felt it so deeply because it was hitting them, so deeply at home in the ways in which they were concerned about their own city, their own neighborhoods, and things of that sort. So this work in particular developed out of interviews that she conducted with mothers in the city of Chicago that had lost their children to gun violence. And what these are, it's kind of hard to see in these images, but she basically, she took these stories, absorbed them, and then went back to her studio in Colombia and then produced these works. And these are these very fine, almost like shawls or tunics of some sort, almost like these shirts, but they're made entirely of needles. So in each one, there's probably a good 15,000 needles that create the form of the work itself. And if you could imagine wearing something like that, every time you moved, breathed, or even, shifted your body in any possible way, you'd feel an immediate prick of pain, right? I mean, the needles would constantly be there and constantly affecting you. And that became this manifestation of the pain that these mothers shared with her, of what it felt like to live with the loss of their children every day. So these works in particular developed directly out of that particular context. A few other installation views of her exhibition. Again, more furniture works. And then this kind of beautiful but very disturbing piece. Again, almost creating, like doing the impossible with some of these works. This work is made entirely of rose petals that have been basically suspended. They're basically kind of in a suspended state, so they're not decaying, they're no longer growing, but they're kind of almost, I don't know what the right word is exactly, but through a process that she developed, a very scientific process, she figured out how to have them retain their color but also be preserved. And so this is about, I don't even remember now, I think over 50,000 rose petals all stitched together by hand to create this massive tapestry that almost becomes like this Red Sea. But the idea behind it came about, the simple gesture of making a flower offering. When someone passes away, you lose someone important to you, or you want to share condolences, you often bring flowers. And so this was Doris's gesture of bringing flowers to the victims of Colombia. But again, a very kind of beautiful, if not moving and kind of disturbing piece. So that's one example, and a very dark one. Sorry, hopefully you all don't feel terribly depressed at this moment. I'll move on to where I work now. This is the Eli and Edythe Art Museum at Michigan State University. Basically like a spaceship that landed out in the cornfield there in mid-Michigan. Very much unlike anything else in the surrounding area. Zaha Hadid design building. It's a really beautiful, dynamic space. Also very challenging to work in. There are no right angles in the building except for the doors, which is a very irregular space to work in. Most museums are very kind of boxy and grid-like. This is the exact opposite of that. But for that reason, I really enjoyed it. It makes you very conscious of the space that you're working in, and again, kind of provides a certain context for the work that we do.
Who did you say was the architect?
Zaha Hadid,
Egyptian woman?
Iraqi-born, I believe. Yeah, she passed away a couple years ago now,
Right.
but the only female architect to ever win the Pritzker Prize. But so she's, yeah, I mean, she's pretty amazing. This building is also the only, I think the only, hopefully you can double check me later, but I think the only freestanding building designed and built by her in her lifetime in North America. She has another building, another museum in Cincinnati called the Contemporary Art Center, but that's downtown Cincinnati and it's kind of built up between other buildings, so it's not entirely freestanding. And then since she passed, I think a building of hers, a residential building in New York has opened and a couple other projects, but this is really, a pretty remarkable, and for it to be in East Lansing, Michigan is pretty wild, I think. One exhibition I want to talk about here is this piece called Beyond Streaming, a sound mural for Flint. And so this is a very different way of working, a very different kind of approach to this idea of curating in context. So coming from Chicago to East Lansing, of course I was aware of the Flint water crisis, but I hadn't, it was like everyone, I was very aware of it, obviously very deeply disturbed and distraught about it, but it seemed like it was somewhere else, right? I mean, there was this empathic response to it, but like Flint could have been anywhere as far as I was concerned, being in Chicago. But being in East Lansing, the proximity was more palpable, and so I started to really think a little bit more about trying to do something, trying to create some kind of response to the Flint water crisis while being there. And of course, at the university, there was a lot of work already being done in response to the Flint water crisis, and so it seemed important that the museum create some kind of artistic or otherwise kind of cultural response to the issue there. And so I invited an artist named Jan Tichy from Chicago to think with me about developing a project together in response to the situation there. And what unfolded there was basically about 3 or 4 months of research, of he and I just spending a lot of time in Flint, meeting with people, seeing the work being done, going to the water distribution sites, just really spending time in Flint and kind of becoming, not to say that we ever are part of the fabric there, but at least getting to know people and getting to know their stories directly from them, hearing it firsthand and seeing it firsthand. And what we ended up doing, I'm gonna hold back on the slides for a moment, was working with, what we realized early on is that so much of the issue of what happened also had to do with Lansing, of course Lansing being the state capital. And so we realized that, of course there was the whole issue with the emergency manager and the transfer of the water from the Detroit River to the Flint River and all these things, and that all had to do with decisions that were being made in Lansing, the East Lansing, Greater Lansing area. And so it became very important to us to connect those two locations, and we did that by working with a group of high school students in Flint and a group of high school students in Lansing. And between the two of them, by bringing those two groups together and then allowing them to discuss and talk about, their relationships to water, what water meant for them, and to share their experiences with water, that became the heart and soul of the project. And what developed out of that was this installation, which is kind of hard to see because it's I think so wonderfully crafted exactly to the design of the building. But this is our education center, education space in the museum, and you can see along all the windows. It's a little bit hard to see, but all of that is copper piping. And at the ends of those pipes, this is another example. Obviously, tailored specifically to that space, which was no easy feat. But the end of those pipes, or each of those pipes, has a spigot on it. And so Jan, in working with the students, the young people, the idea of creating a mural was something that they gravitated towards. And thinking about making a public comment, a public gesture, the idea of the mural was something that they came up with. And Jan kind of turned that around and said, okay, let's do a mural, but we don't have a wall, we don't really have a space for that. What if we did a sound mural? And so that's essentially what this is that the students involved in the project all recorded their own stories, poems, spoken word pieces. They wrote letters to the governor, or they wrote letters to their parents, or they wrote letters to, imagined individuals, sharing their experiences. And those stories were recorded, and then Jan had the idea that if you put sound in the pipes, and you put a spigot on the end of it, if you close the spigot, will the sound stay in? And if you open it, will the sound come out? And lo and behold, that absolutely works. And that's exactly how this installation works. So people could come and, you could open each of the individual valves, and that person's story would come out of that valve, and you could listen to it. And of course, also thinking about the way that musical instruments work. So the pipe at the very top of the installation is more narrow. It's hard to see from these images, but it's more narrow, and at the base it gets a little bit wider, and so there's this kind of natural or kind of acoustic amplification that happens the same way that a trumpet works or something like that, to allow the sound to kind of spill down and out of the pipes. So what was I going to say next about that? I mean, this piece was really, it was really powerful in a lot of ways. And of course, I should just point out, for those of you that might be interested, the website for this project still exists, and so you can go to beyondstreaming.com. Anyway, if you look up Beyond Streaming, the name of the project, you'll find it. And on there are all the recordings, so you can listen to all the recordings and also see some of the artwork that the students made as a part of the project. This is a group shot of one of our field trips to the state capitol of the groups. But really, the important part about this project was that rather than crafting a response, either from myself or from Jan about the Flint water crisis, that's really not our story to tell. And I credit Jan very much for this. He really recognized the importance of creating a platform, creating a kind of structure that is this sound mural that allows the young people that were involved in this project, that were involved in that, experience the Flint water crisis directly, to speak for themselves, right? It's their voices that share their stories, and it's really just a mechanism in which we can kind of share their voices and then hopefully further amplify them. So recently the project has just also been recreated, I guess, actually. It's a different version of the project in Detroit at the Michigan Science Center. So this is a new version that is actually up right now in Detroit. And this version responds to the shutoff of water in the Detroit public school system. They also found lead and other contaminants in the water in the public school system. So now all the water fountains in the schools are shut off, and they are also using kind of bottled water, otherwise water coolers and things of that sort. So Jan worked with Detroit public school students, again, captured their stories, and those are living inside these pipes currently. It's a very challenging space to document. This atrium space in the Michigan Science Center is kind of a large glass, I think it's about 3 or 4 stories tall, and the whole installation kind of, again, the same way we did it in East Lansing, is crafted directly for that space. And at each of the layers of the stairwell going up, there are spigots that allow people to listen to different stories. So this kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of the depth of it. So Oscar Tuazon, who's also an exhibition that's up right now. It's funny, you think I'm like a curator of water. It's like that should be like a title that they give me at the museum, because again, with this project, I'm addressing issues with water. This show is up currently, but in this case, Oscar brought this idea to create a water school at the museum. This idea of this water school, This is something that he's been doing in different locations across the country. He has one in Los Angeles where he's based. He has one in Minnesota, and he has the Michigan Water School. And the Michigan one was very important to him because, of course, he wanted to be within the Great Lakes region, within the Great Lakes Basin, to have this conversation. And without going in, there's so many layers to this exhibition. I'll try to restrain myself to talk a little bit just specifically about this idea of curating in context. So much of this project has to do with kind of environmental sustainability, environmental building practices, but also creating greater awareness about the water resources that exist in our vicinity, but also the ways in which they are under threat. So he came to us in particular to build this new piece. He wanted to design what he calls a water window, which is based on the ideas of this inventor named Steve Baer, who was part of this outlaw architecture building movement of the 1960s and 70s, specifically in the Southwest. And the idea of the water window is a passive solar architectural feature. So the idea with these windows, as they originally existed, or the original design was that you'd have a large glass window in a house, and you'd have this system with these barrels of drums filled with water, and then over the course of the day, the water heats up in the drums. At night, you close the kind of covering of the window, and all the heat is released into the house. So you have this very simple system, but it works, obviously extremely well. In the right climate, I should point out, that would not work very well in Michigan, I don't think, but that's a different story. But anyway, Oscar was convinced that there was the problem with the original design, which is kind of represented by this image that you see here on the glass, is that you lose the window itself. And so he was very keen on the idea of recovering the aesthetics of the window, so to speak, but also hopefully updating or otherwise advancing the ideas around passive solar architecture, specifically through the use of water. And so this piece we built together along with a number of engineers at the university. And in this piece, you literally have the volume of water. It sits between the two glass panes and does the same thing, but allows the window to still function as a window. But of course, Oscar took it one step forward and also wanted the window to be this giant door. And this is about, I think, 14 by about 9 or 10 feet wide. I mean, so this is a massive, massive architectural feature. And it all it rotates or pivots on this single axis. So the engineers were super excited about this project because it allowed them, as the artists that they are, to kind of show off a little bit and trying to figure this out. Because without the water, it's around, I think, 3,000 pounds, and the water itself almost doubles the weight at that volume. So it's a pretty massive and kind of incredible feat. But this is. So I promised I wasn't gonna get off tangent, but now I'm off on a tangent. But this was this idea of prototyping, which is very much a large part of Oscar's his practice. This idea of prototyping is something that happens at the university all the time. So also situating this project and this conversation of the water school at a university art museum, and specifically at Michigan State University, was really quite meaningful. Of course, there's the history of Michigan State being a land-grant university, so there's already, these ideas of ecological or environmental issues are part of its DNA. So again, like a very important, a very kind of, it feels like the right place to have these kinds of conversations. But with all the research that's been done at the university and all the ways in which prototyping and otherwise trying to advance certain ideas is being done there, that Oscar's work really speaks to that as well. Within the exhibition, we also, you see this large architectural space that he created, also a reference to Steve Baer, but I won't go into that. You see that there's a library here, and this structure itself is really that is the heart, that is the core of the exhibition, that serves primarily as the space of the water school. And to create a library, to put a library of books at the center of the exhibition, I think is a really important gesture on the part of the artist. It's really saying that education and information and knowledge sharing is really what art and really what is needed at this moment in time. And all of these books were loaned to us from the MSU library. So we worked with the librarians at the university to make a selection of books, to create a bibliography for the exhibition, which they then lend to us for the entire duration. And so people can come and peruse the books, There's a little system that our education team created where you can leave, you can mark a page and leave a note explaining why you chose a certain passage or what spoke to you about this particular page for other people to come and also find and look at and engage with. So the other feature of the exhibition I just want to touch upon quickly is this idea of research. So within the exhibition, of course, we had basically 2 galleries of Oscar's work, and then this third gallery that all features the research behind his work. And all this research comes from, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, from the university collections. So the special collections at the library or other university collections. And it involves things like the Whole Earth Catalog, which was this amazing publication that was printed late 60s, early 70s. That was really almost like the internet before the internet. If you haven't seen one of these things, it's incredible. You should check it out. The work of Buckminster Fuller is a important forerunner to a lot of Oscar's work, as well as the work of Steve Baer. All this is presented in these cases. And so to carve out a space within the exhibition to put the research itself, to display it in the same way that you would display the artwork and kind of create that even kind of playing field, so to speak, was it really, I think, an important gesture. And I think, again, highlights the importance or what it means to be working at a university art museum and to be engaging with projects within a university setting. The last comment about the exhibition, as with Jan's project, so much of it can't be represented in images because so much of Jan's project as well as Oscar's project takes place between people in conversation. So every first Wednesday and third Wednesday of the month during the run of the exhibition, we program the Water School and various events take place. And that's been going on since basically late January. This was one of the opening inaugural conversations that took place. So people every week, or every one of those sessions convene in the space, and they do a wide range of different programs within that, from art making to reading workshops to watching films to all sorts of various things. And so much of that, again, the kind of the heart and soul of the exhibition exists between people in dialogue, galvanizing conversations, and hopefully bringing awareness to some of these issues. Which brings us here. Hopefully you all recognize this building because you walked into it earlier today. And so, bring me back to during this exhibition, again, as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, I was really drawn so much. I mean, there was so many great artists and many, many great artworks that I saw in this selection. And it's always this weird thing where you're like, how do you start to make sense of this? Or what are the criteria by which you start to judge them themselves? Because just because I like someone's individual practice, that doesn't necessarily translate to an exhibition for me, right? And not to say that I necessarily curated this exhibition, but certainly it was important to me to develop some framework to understand what I was looking at, and otherwise kind of compare and contrast and make some determination about what I thought should be included in this exhibition. And what I started to gravitate more and more so, I found for myself, was again the works of the artists that I felt were really kind of somehow expressing some quality, some essence, if you can say that, about what it meant to live and work and live north of the 45th. And so that became somewhat of a guiding principle for how I selected some of the works from the exhibition. The other thing that really was important to me was to show a wider variety. Sorry, I mean, this is an exhibition, hopefully you've all seen this. If you haven't, you'll see it in images and then you'll go into the gallery and see it in person. But these was to show the various kind of materials and textures in the different ways in which creative expression manifests itself north of the 45th. So photography, sculpture, printmaking, of course painting, photography, I mean, all the different ways that artists found ways to express themselves. I wanted to include those different textures within the exhibition too. So it became this kind of balancing of both the content, the kind of conceptual stuff, the ways in which documenting different aspects of life or expressing certain aspects of life north of the 45th, while also translating that into specific material or artistic practices. and you all can be the judge as to whether that was successful or not. But from my perspective, I think it's a really nice looking exhibition, and I didn't install it. I just, I did the jurying, but credit to Emily and her team. I think it's actually quite a stunning exhibition, in my opinion. So I don't want to leave on a total, there's some like kind of heavy stuff I talked about throughout this talk, and I also want to show a few things that continue to inspire me in the work that I do, that kind of keep me kind of going. A couple of these things I keep in my office, not this in particular. This is a letter from René Magritte, the kind of famous surrealist painter, to André Breton. I wish I had this in my office, but that would be a little bit absurd. But anyway, there's this quote that he writes about in here. He talks about, here is how I understand utopia. And utopia has always been this really challenging concept or term for me, something I've always been very suspicious of. But when I read this, it really resonated with me. But Magritte says, "It's not a dream that happens in the future, but utopia is located in the golden age within the boundaries of our own lives." I thought that was really quite beautiful. This other work by the Swiss duo Fischli and Weiss, How to Work Better. This poster does sit in my office because every time I embark on an exhibition or a project or anything, frankly, these things without fail are totally relevant. And if you can find something that this does not speak to, I would love to hear what that could possibly be, because it is, I think almost every single day I'm at work, if not also at home or anywhere else in life, the grocery store, that this is totally applicable. And as a last note, this dear friend of mine, Jason Lazarus, who's also an artist, has this project called Try Harder. And if you write to him and send him a pre-filled out envelope, he will print out this picture of Otis Redding belting out his heart on stage, and he'll write "Try Harder" on it, and he'll send it back to you. And so I have this photo of Otis belting out his heart on stage with Jason's small little handwriting, "Try Harder" on it. And every day when things get harder, dealing with difficult subjects or difficult artists, I remind myself, I look at this and think that, there's always more work to be done, and there's always more we can do to try harder. So with that, I will leave you all. Think more. And then I think we have some time for questions, if anyone wants to.
Questions, feel free to raise your hand, shout them out.
Who wants to go first? Sure, go ahead.
Sure. So as a curator for like larger organizations, where do the relationship with the artists that you're installing and working with has to be? Like, how do you court those? I mean, is it just based on the person, or are those relationships? I don't know. I just find it interesting. I never really thought about the curator working so intensely with somebody. Like, are you full in these projects with these people, like putting the pipes together and doing the research? You had said that you did a lot of that. I mean,
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I'd say it's absolutely that case, and it's absolutely a relationship. And it's funny you use the word courting, because I joke about that. I mean, like I half joke about it, because it really is. It's like a relationship, and you do fight, you do make up, you know what I mean? Like all the things in a relationship. That's also what that kind of curator-artist relationship is like as well. But it's also something that develops over a long period of time. So, I mean, certainly there are artists I don't know super well that I'll invite to do projects and get to know them through that process. I mean, of course, like if I've never met you before and I've never seen your work, we haven't spent time together, then I wouldn't work with you. I mean, there has to be some basis, some shared understanding between us to kind of embark on that process together. And so a lot of that comes down to, a lot of research that I do, a lot of spending time with artists. And I think even artists I've known for years, if not decades, sometimes I think they look at me and they feel a little bit like, why haven't we worked together yet? And there's also so many variables that go into kind of, again, that right moment in which to kind of produce a project together, an exhibition together. And so much of that has to do with context. And so, I mean, just as an example, working, in this building that I work in now, it's really designed much more for sculpture or installation than it is for two-dimensional works on the walls. There's very limited, like, how do you say, perpendicular wall space. There's walls that are at 70-degree angles, like you can't show, paintings or works on that, but the space is very voluminous, so it's clear that it's clear to me that she created a sculpture that's also nice to show sculpture in. But even within that, not everyone's practice translates to the spaces. Like, that building is so overwhelming and could be so oppressive in certain ways that if you're not finding ways, or if you don't have a certain kind of practice that can be tailored to those spaces to some degree, then the building always wins, So you have to work with that building, and it has to be an artist that, in my opinion, for some of those larger spaces, I've been gravitating more towards artists that have a kind of architectural language or practice built into their larger practice, that they're able and kind of willing to take on the unique, let's say, architectural features of that building. Yeah.
That is interesting.
So, but yeah, I'm constantly looking and meeting with artists. Because of where I'm located now, there's not a ton of artists that live in the Lansing area. So that's kind of forced me to travel a little bit more. When I was in Chicago, of course, there's a much larger community there. But, so I spend a lot of time in Detroit. It's great to do things like these juries and other, these kinds of opportunities, because you just get exposed to artists and artworks that you may not otherwise come across. So I spend as much time as I can researching, out looking and doing that kind of stuff. But then, yeah, it all starts with the conversation. And it's important to have that first conversation. Again, it could be 10, 15 years before you do anything together, but it always has to start somewhere. So, especially the artists, I say that, I feel like I'm pretty accessible as much as I can be. And even if we can't meet in person, like doing a Skype or something like that, like that's always it's a nice way to at least kind of have some level of face-to-face, get to know each other a little bit. Yeah, that it's, I wouldn't be bashful about inviting someone to have a conversation, or inviting someone to your studio or whatever it may be, because if they say no, then you don't want to work with them anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, but especially in the solo projects, when you work with a single artist, the group show, that's a very different kind of working process. But in that solo projects exhibition, that's usually a very close relationship, and really a collaboration, between the curator and the artist.
Thank you.
A very simple observation. You didn't quite say it, but I gather that you put this show together in Lansing, which is in a sense out of context, looking at imagining life above the 45th.
Yeah. And yeah, I had to think about that for a minute. Yeah, and so in that case, like, well, you have to ask Emily about her decision making there and inviting me to do that. But it's like I'm out of context in that way, or maybe out of context isn't the right frame. But it is definitely me imagining, or my kind of impressions of what life is like above the 45th versus not being a resident or otherwise. I do frequent it a little bit, but anyway. But yeah, so it's. I think there can be value in having someone outside of that context also kind of weigh in on what that looks like or feels like or something.
Thanks for
like
doing it.
that. Yeah. Well, my pleasure. Yeah. Sorry.
Kind of a follow-up to that first question, like having to curate in a building like that, have you found it really inspiring, like to work within that kind of like framework literally of those walls, or have you been kind of annoyed that sometimes you can't work with an artist who wants to just put a picture on the wall? Like, how do you navigate that? Has it been cool? Like, does it differ to like working in Chicago where it is just a flat wall?
Right.
I mean, obviously it is, but.
Yeah. So the building was definitely a big draw for me for the job, right? It's literally the antithesis of the white cube
Right.
space, exhibition space model. So it's super dynamic. But I'd say, I've been there, I'll be 4 years in November. Probably, maybe it was like a year ago now I've got the hang of it. You know what I mean? Like now I feel like I've cracked the code a little bit. But there are many times that it could be really frustrating, or things that you want to work just didn't. And not to say that there were any kind of like major failures, but it's just because of the dynamics of that building, and there was definitely a learning curve in understanding what works and what doesn't work in those spaces. But maybe this is not something I mentioned, but meant to. But that's where, I guess like the subtitle of the talk kind of points to this. But the work that I was doing in Chicago, it's not the same work that I'm doing in East Lansing, and it's not the same work that I would do here as if I lived here. And so, while the concerns and the interest may be the same, obviously I think you can see that I gravitate to the kind of like social and political issues and these kinds of commentaries, but I couldn't produce the same work I do in Chicago in East Lansing. That those contexts really have shifted my way of working, and that's also certainly the building as well. So definitely, there's lots of shows that in the back of my mind are artists I would love to work with that just I feel would not be appropriate in that particular context. And so that does become limiting, but for me it's the parameters, it's like, I think my creativity, I think creativity in general thrives by having some kind of constraint to work within and maybe also against, but if you could just do anything anywhere, I would be like crippled with, like, I can do anything, like, I'd be able to do nothing basically. So it's been important to me to figure that out and to kind of respond thoughtfully to that architecture. Also, that the University Art Museum is a very different animal than a kind of freestanding public institution, and so also navigating the university structure, that's a whole nother thing. There's some chuckling, so you all know what that's like a little bit. But all of those things kind of just they become part of the process. And that's a challenge to me to kind of be adaptable, to be able to work in that context. And it's not to say that artists who have a kind of architectural practice as part of their larger practice is not something that I necessarily gravitate towards. But within this context, like that's something that I felt that I've needed to cultivate, because I feel like that is an interesting conversation to have within that building particularly. Yeah. You had a question too?
Yeah, I'll do this like back and forth and follow up on that question.
Yeah,
the
sure.
idea of being on the outside and looking in and putting the show together, were there themes, or do you remember things? I mean, even work that was or wasn't selected where, whoa, they like lighthouses, or they're cold, or they're hippies, or what did it look like? What does our context look like from Lansing?
Okay, yeah. I may have set myself a trap here. But it's like all of those things, right? I mean, I don't know if, certainly kind of like, I think like the beauty of the natural environment is something that stuck out to me, and like the natural resources that exist here. I mean, that's something that really stuck out to me. But also, not just that those things exist, but the appreciation for them. So a lot of works that kind of engage with the natural, with the wildlife, with the natural beauty of the landscape and things of that sort came across. And the landscape itself is quite different, right? I mean, like, being surrounded by the Great Lakes and the different formations and geological history of this area, that informs a lot of those works. And so those things start to come out through some of the works. But there are other much more intangible things. This is not an intangible thing, but there's a number of works that also there's this kind of almost like scrapping, recycling kind of practice, right? A lot of artists, they're using very old things, the antiques, and the remnants of other structures or other kind of things that once were and are no longer. Like the recycling of those kinds of materials into practices is something that I found, or at least I responded to in the call with several of the works that you'll see in the exhibition. The photography was probably the most challenging thing. I think in like the first pass that I made through the selection, I probably had it was probably 70% photography, because photography is also like, it's so beautiful and so alluring, right? I mean, like, beautiful photographs are just like, oh, like you want this, right? And so when it came towards refining that list, I started having to make really difficult decisions about which photographs to include, and there was a lot of repetition in subject matter, of course, whether they're from Marquette or not, the ORDOC being represented, or, Presque Isle, or certain other features that are such important features, but, are often gravitated to by many different people, and so that became really difficult in terms of sorting that out, because I also wanted to make room for, again, like, that it wasn't just a show of photography, that there was a kind of wider range of materials and practices. So but I think part of it too was not, well, I said, like, even though I kind of created this framework, it's not specific, right? It's not about, like, oh, this is what people who live north of the 45th, you know what I mean? Like, that would be highly inappropriate for me to kind of project, but it's a little bit more of those kinds of, like, I don't know. It's not helpful to say things like residues and textures, but, like, that's like, the kind of where my mind goes to. Yeah.
Thanks.
And you can judge from me. I mean, I would love to hear your feedback about the works that are represented, I mean, that's where, again, like, I'm sure there's certain things that I romanticize about, about the north of the 45th that for you all, or for people that live north of the 45th, they're kind of like, it's the everyday thing that they see that's maybe more unremarkable, or I don't know,
Thanks.
We have time for one more question.
One more question.
How many submissions did you curate?
Emily, do you remember?
There's 60 works and 52 works and 32 artists in the show.
How many were submitted?
I think around 150 with 6 pieces each. Each artist could submit up to 6 pieces, so quite a few.
Wow.
Yeah.
Quite a few. It's quite the task that any juror does, taking on this
Yeah.
exhibition.
Yeah, and so there was also some consideration about space too, obviously. I mean, the gallery is not infinite. I want to be somewhat gentle on Emily and her team in terms of figuring out how to fit everything in there. There was definitely conversations about, like, Stephen, have you been looking at the dimensions of some of these works? Like, oh yeah, I should probably do that. Was there anything?
Any other questions?
There was one more question up there.
There was,
Yeah.
and going back to his original question,
Okay.
and your discussion about relationships with artists and how you choose them, or that process.
Yeah.
Are they reaching out to you, or are you reaching out to them?
Both.
Both.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I get contacted from artists almost every week, I would say. And I mean, the large majority of that are things that I'm not particularly struck by immediately. But I always appreciate the fact that if someone's reaching out to me, like, I mean, that's great. They should be doing that, And so I always take the time to look at it and then try to respond to it in some thoughtful way. And if it's not, something that seems, that I want to necessarily kind of engage with at this moment in time, I'll just let them know that. You know what I mean? But yeah, and then there's other artists that I'll reach out to, or I say, like, if I'm traveling, I'll be in the area, that I want to try to meet up or get together or something like that. So it definitely works both ways. But I'm always, there's also a certain level of flattery. If someone reaches out to you, and this is actually the thing that bothers me. If I know that I'm getting a kind of the same email that they're sending to everyone, that rubs me the wrong way. But if they reach out to me and they say, hey, like, I've been looking at your work that you do as a curator, or I'm thinking about what it means, where your museum is, and again, these ideas around context, and I think my work might be interesting to you for this and this and this reason, then right away I'll be far more kind of interested and open to having that conversation than if someone's just like, I found your name on the website, I know nothing about you, but you should know about my work. I mean, yeah.
Thank you so much. And we're happy to answer more questions in the gallery. There's going to be a quick performance by a marching band, so you might want to earmuffs if you need to. Otherwise, I'm going to do the awards in the gallery at 8.
quite